there's equally bad outcomes on either side of the extremes here. One side is the top-down mandate that says everybody in this organization, all 20,000 of you, Mondays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays in the office. That just doesn't sit well and doesn't work well for teams. But the other thing that doesn't work is saying to everybody figure it out for yourselves. Hey, look, I'm going in, but I'm not seeing anybody, and I'm spending my days dialing into Zoom meetings all day long. That just stinks. You've got to find a balance point in the middle. That center point is teams. Teams are the center of where work gets done. You've got to invest in giving them the muscles around this stuff, as opposed to thinking that either chaos is going to work, which it doesn't, or top-down commands are going to solve all these problems, which they won't.
Welcome to the Work for Humans podcast. This is Dart Lindsley. Over the last few years, it seemed that there was this never-ending discussion about remote work. And at first it was interesting, but if I'm being honest, I reached a point where I was kind of over the whole topic. That is, until I heard Brian Elliott speak at the Running Remote conference in Lisbon. Brian's an esteemed author. He's a speaker and a leadership advisor, and he's currently serving as the executive leader of Future Forum, which is a think tank that focuses on the future of work. With almost 3 decades of experience in leadership, he has successfully led teams and built companies, both as a startup CEO and as an executive at Google and Slack. His insights have been featured in publications such as Fortune, Harvard Business Review, and Time, and his recent book, How the Future Works, talks about the true definition behind flexible work, and it encompasses a whole lot more than just working from home. In this episode, Brian and I talk about the leadership experience around distributed work, defining the purpose behind a company's work style, and strategies to level the playing field for employees of all kinds. We also discuss measuring outcomes based on teamwork, creating a culture of connection from anywhere, prioritizing schedule flexibility over geographic flexibility, and other topics. If you find this episode valuable, be sure to subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. And now, please enjoy this engaging dialogue with Brian Elliott. Brian Elliott, welcome to Work for Humans.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me, Dart.
It's great to have you here. And I'll tell you a little bit of the backstory, which was that I have had a lot by my standards of people come on the show to talk about remote work. And a part of the reason is I think it's a very interesting design problem. And it's something that has forced us to break out of habits of work that we have been in for a long time and relook at it. I don't think it's the only design issue related to work, but I think it's a really great test case. So I thought I was done talking about distributed work, remote work, but then I heard you speak in Lisbon. And I thought that you had a level of clarity and a level of scope of understanding that was really important and really helped me to see it in a different light. And so that's why I wanted to have you on today and talk a lot about your most recent book, How the Future Works. And I want to dig into that a lot more deeply. So the first thing I want to ask is, there's a lot of emotion around remote work, and there's a lot of emotion around return to office. And people seem to be taking sides, and it's very hard to tell what's real because of how strongly people feel about it. And so that's where I want to start. What's the zeitgeist right now in terms of both distributed work and moves toward return to office in reality?
The reality is, I'm surprised myself that 4 years in, getting obnoxiously close to 5 years in, we're still having this debate and it generates as much heat as it does. But I guess at the end of the day, I shouldn't be. We went through a sea change 4.5 years ago in people's expectation, put people into much different situations that sort of upended a lot of our own expectations, right? I was a 5-day-a-week in the office kind of guy for several decades. And that was my understanding of where and when and how work got done. And even though I had led and managed distributed teams, meaning groups of people that didn't show up in the same office, let alone the same city, it was still sort of a sea change even for me. And I think what you get into is there's this human reaction that actually has very little to do with remote or not remote. It has to do with trust. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges that sits underneath all of this, which is when executives hear the word remote, it can be off putting. It can cause them to have concerns about, are people really working? And I've heard this directly from CEOs who've said things to me like, I don't know if they're walking the dog 4 hours a day at home, but I know if they're in the office, they can't be walking the dog 4 hours a day. So if that's one of the reasons that's driving a return to office policy, which underlying sometimes it is, it's not also unusual then that the people on the other end of that spectrum, the employees of your company, have an adverse reaction to being told that they need to be in the office 3, 4, 5 days a week when they've been perfectly productive working from home. And the challenge in all this is the extremes of this are not what most people want, either executives or employees. There's only about 15% of the global workforce that wants to be fully remote, meaning together with their team less than once a month. There's about 20% of the global workforce that wants to be in the office because they need an office space on a 5-day-a-week basis. And most people want something in the middle. They want regular time together with their team for something that's purposeful and meaningful. And if you can find a way to make that work, then you unlock a hell of a lot of goodwill, as well as you dig into all the research and all the various findings and all the rest of it, not just goodwill and better engagement, but you can actually balance out a lot of things around productivity, connection, and really importantly, build more inclusive teams.
I think the trust part is incredibly important. And I think it goes both ways. And I face this a lot when I speak, which is that there are some people who simply cannot trust executives to have the best interest of the company at heart in many cases, or the best interest of the long-term longevity of the company. And essentially, the belief there is that people believe only in money. And the reverse is the lack of trust, which is that people don't like to work, going the opposite direction. If we're not watching them all the time and applying surveillance, they're not going to work. And I think there's a lot of information. I'm sure that both are true sometimes. Both are true sometimes. There's a lot of information that shows that both are not true a lot of the time. I'll say one other thing here, which is I realized, it might have been while you were speaking in Lisbon, that one of the challenges of remote work, we talk a lot about the experience design of the experience of work, but there's an experience design problem for leaders. And it's the experience of not having people in the office. And I remember what that was like when Cisco went remote. It felt bad. I'd go into the office as a leader. It was dark. Nobody'd even turn on the lights. It felt really bad. So what can we do to change the experience of leaders and how they experience distributed work?
I think a couple of things there. And I have had this conversation with leaders too around especially the trust issue and what you're getting at, which is, sure, there are some people that are cheating the system. But when you put in place policies that apply to everyone in order to catch the percentage, and what do you think it is? 5%, maybe 10% of your workforce that's cheating the system? But when you put in place a policy that says, I need you back in the office 4 days a week, and you're doing it for that reason, what reaction do you think that causes in the people that are actually putting their nose to the grindstone and doing the work? Because you're painting everybody with that same broad brushstroke. And there's just tons of evidence out there. This great study from Institute for Corporate Productivity that got at trust as the key factor for driving organizational performance. And that lack of trust that you're exhibiting causes people who are most capable of getting another job to take another job, is the other knock-on effect from it. So as an executive, you're sort of faced with that. And what I try to do is help people paint the better path forward, which is instead of doing the mandate and the top-down command, we actually ought to be talking with teams about what are the types of activities that actually they think, and they kind of agree, are better done together. So how do you start building those rhythms? And the thing that I'll say to employees too is an individual free-for-all also doesn't work. And people realize that and they understand it. There's equally bad outcomes on either side of the extremes here. One side is the top-down mandate that says everybody in this organization, all 20,000 of you, that, by the way, work in a variety of different teams with a variety of different needs and different conditions. The answer for all 20,000 of you is Mondays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays in the office. That just doesn't sit well and doesn't work well for teams for a variety of reasons I can get into. But the other thing that doesn't work is saying to everybody figure it out for yourselves. Each of you as individuals figure it out, because most people want time together with their teams. They want it to be coordinated at a minimum. So if you're instead saying, hey, look, I'm going in, but I'm not seeing anybody and I'm spending my days dialing into Zoom meetings all day long, that just stinks. And I think people get that. And so you've got to find a balance point in the middle. And for me, and what I've seen work the most is that center point is teams. The teams that you work with, whether it's a functional team or a project team, figuring out what are their norms, what are their agreements for how they are going to work together. Why do we come into the office? But also a lot of other issues around things like, how do we make sure that we have time available for one another? How do we sync up our calendars? What tools do we use? Just a bunch of things that get into that. Teams are the center of where work gets done. You've got to invest in giving them the muscles around this stuff, as opposed to thinking that either chaos is going to work, which it doesn't, or top-down commands are going to solve all these problems, which they won't.
One of the things you recommend is that companies decide what the purpose of their work style is. The way you describe that is, it's in the 7 steps to get to the future of work. Stand for something. What does that mean? And what have you seen companies stand for when it comes to this design?
When it comes to, from a design perspective, especially when you start getting into flexible work, which is what we're really talking about here, more so than remote work, it comes back to what's your stance from a talent perspective. So how do I think about flexibility and what it does for us in terms of our ability to attract and retain talent? But also, how do we think about the limits that we want to put around flexibility in order to make sure that we build connection? So I'll give you a couple of examples. One is a lot of organizations have said, hey, look, we're going to take a flexible approach to work because we know it disproportionately benefits caregivers in our population. Women more than men need it. People with different capabilities and abilities have greater needs for it. We want to tap the broadest possible pools of talent that we can lay our hands on. Therefore, we see flexibility as an advantage. So we're going to design for that. But the other side of it is we also know that connection is really important. And we know that in-person helps accelerate that. And you can take a variety of approaches there. But one example, Royal Bank of Canada, when they rolled this out, talked about proximity matters. They still wanted people basically to live within a couple hours commute of an office so that they could get there on their own on a regular basis, once a week or once a month, whatever was right for their team. You'll have other organizations that will take a different approach. Airbnb has a much broader range at which they'll hire people. They still want people to getting together several times a year, which means they have to invest in travel in order to make that happen. But it starts out usually with a conversation about talent and what's our talent strategy in the first place, and what both advantages do we get out of having more distributed teams and organizations, and what are we going to do? What are our principles around getting people together from a purpose-driven perspective, which can be things that get very specific, like onboarding programs, like training programs, like the kickoff for a new project. People understand the purpose behind it. And that gets you a lot further, a lot faster than simply putting out a policy.
Is there ever essentially a moral or ethical reason for doing this? So what I just heard in a lot of what you said is, I'm going to do this based upon what it gets for me, the company, which is, how am I going to make this work for me? And I say me, but I really do mean the company.
The organization.
The organization. Is there ever a why, which is, I think it is right. I think freedom is good. And giving freedom is actually a moral obligation, not infinite freedom, but as much as we can.
Yeah, exactly. Flexibility inside of a framework. How do we provide that to people?
Yeah.
Because I actually do believe that it's better for people. There actually are really strong moral arguments on that basis, which is every individual has a different set of needs in terms of what works best for them, especially when it comes down to things like what's best for you in terms of being able to do heads down work. For some people, that actually is being in a noisy environment with lots of other stuff going on because that's how they focus. For some people, it means mornings versus evenings. That flexibility and freedom actually has benefits to the company as well. But it also gets to things like you can hire a more diverse workforce if you take a broader lens on this problem. San Francisco and the Bay Area is not noted for having a large Black office worker employment opportunity, but the Southeast of the United States is. And if you're going to try to expand, depending on the populations you're trying to bring in, because it's important to you, both ethically and in terms of building your business, then you have to think about what's the aperture that I'm opening up on that perspective. Look, if you look at the stats from the past few years, we're an all-time high of women's participation in the workforce, prime age women's participation, including women with children under the age of 6. We're at an all-time high of people who are handicapped participating in the workforce. And there are direct correlations between the flexibility that you give those groups and their ability to work and to sustain the balance between work and their lives and still contribute mightily to their company and their organization's goals. So there are lots of reasons to do it on that basis. And the last one I'll give you is Professor Raj Chowdhury out of HBS has done a lot on this in terms of community development. So the economic development and the sort of reversal of brain drain that can happen from the ability to hire people in more locations and people to work from different locations. Tulsa Remote is actually a community development organization funded by the Kaiser Family Foundation that actually has been highly successful in getting economic development to happen in the city of Tulsa because there are more people who are willing to work there that actually have good paying jobs that are actually also supporting their local community.
That's a very interesting one. Just to fill in what Tulsa Remote is. Tulsa, as I understand it, and you can correct me, set out to make Tulsa just an amazing remote location where people can go work, get an affordable house, be supported with bandwidth, a lot like what Portugal did, actually, for digital nomads. Or, well, Portugal's sort of the poster child, I think.
Exactly.
I actually know where they are because my podcast is number one in countries that has a group of people who are thinking about how they might design their own work. If I remember correctly, did Tulsa Remote start before the pandemic?
It did.
It did. So it had a head start there.
It predated the pandemic. What they've done that's actually a little bit differentiated, they started off with what a lot of municipalities have followed on with, which is financial incentive, right? $10,000 paid out over the course of a year if you stay as incentive for you to move to Tulsa. But what they did that was different was they actually put a lot of programming around it. It's not just the incentive that works, because then what you can get is nomads who plunk down and then move on to the next city for the next paycheck. They actually did a lot around things like social connection. So how do we help people build networks and social connections with one another? Training and workshops around things like how do you actually make sure that as a remote worker, you are showing up for work, that you are visible inside of your organization, how to remain productive as a remote worker, lots of other things like that that just are helpful to the people going through the program. But I think it's that sort of social connection aspect of it that's been actually one of the big differentiators.
Do you know anything about how it's functioned economically there?
I know that it's been pretty decent net benefit. I don't know to what extent. I know that from a lot of other municipalities' perspective, they're the shining example of a program that's worked really well, partly because you get people who are sticky. You don't end up with people just showing up, paying the rent for 6 months to a year or 3 months to a year, and then packing up and moving on. It's built a community.
So before we go any further, just because I know you have a broad purview of something that I don't think we've discussed enough on the show, how are the data stacking up on productivity? And you may remember, I don't know if you heard one of my sessions, I did 2 sessions in Lisbon, but one of them was about how to measure productivity of distributed workers. And I said, don't. But to be clear, what I said was, I think that the cost of measurement exceeds the value of the measurement, is what I said. But nonetheless, I'd be interested to know if there is quality research that's coming in that answers some of the questions that people might have about productivity of distributed or digital first work or flexible work.
Yeah. There's tons of research studies that have been done in the past few years on all of this. On fully remote people, meaning people who never come into an office ever, the results are mixed, to be honest. There are results studies out of India in 2020 that show negative results. No one should be surprised by that. I happened to be leading a team of engineers who were based in India at that point in time, and it was a pretty horrific set of experiences they were going through, literally in order, not only just the personal situations and illness and death and families and things like that. But if you wanted to do work, you had to tether off of your phone in a very crowded space in order to make it work. So that's not surprising. Most studies have a single digit percentage, one way or another, productivity advantage or disadvantage for fully remote. Hybrid, some form of hybrid, quote unquote, seems to be the best. So again, Raj Chaudhuri probably did one of the best studies of this. They actually put people into different cohorts in an organization in terms of when they come together. The teams, importantly, set what they're like. If you put people into a group that said 25% of the time you're going to be working together, the team would decide, does that mean 1 or 2 days a week, or does that mean 1 week a month? Those groups actually showed the highest rates of collaboration, creative production, meaning they're actually measuring the output of the groups in the organization, and were sizably better than people who were completely remote or people who were more than 50% in the office, both of whom actually had some lagging effects around that. There's something to this. Brian Chesky from Airbnb said something about this recently too. When you are in the rut, in the same place, in the same space on a day in, day out basis, and I think that's true whether that's at home or in the office, you can just fall into your calendar and fall into the same thing over and over and over again. There's some value in that disruption. It makes seeing that group of people a little bit more special. It means you're going to use that time maybe a little bit more productively to work deeper on a set of problems if you're coming together once a month as opposed to showing up every single day. And so there's growing evidence that some form of hybrid has the best impact on outcomes. And we already know that it's actually what the vast majority of people want. And so it has great knock-on effects on things like engagement, retention of employees that are actually really important.
It's an interesting, the bit about teams setting their own norms. I have to admit, my own team's norms will have more influence over me than a tops-down mandate.
Yeah, it's just absolutely how it works. Part of what's going on here underneath all this too is organizations have become more distributed post-pandemic. Almost every organization I've worked with and talked with hired people in far more locations, but also we've inverted the management job. Pre-pandemic at Microsoft, 2/3 of teams were co-located. Manager plus everybody on the team was in the same city in the same building. Now it's more like 75% are distributed. Only 25% are co-located. So if you've taken this problem, I've dealt with teams that were distributed for a couple of decades. I always managed people who were in multiple locations. I was used to it. But that was not the norm. That was the minority case prior to the pandemic. I think in most large organizations, that's now inverted. So we put managers in this position of you're managing a team that's in multiple cities. That's also one of the reasons why you got to figure out what the norm is for your team. But also it's one of the reasons why if you hear a leader say, I need you back in the office 3 or 4 days a week to be with your team, there's a big part of the organization that goes, that doesn't make any sense. Our team's distributed. We're not in the same office in the first place, Chief.
Yeah, I've always managed teams of internal consultants, and our clients are distributed geographically. And so we've never had particular locations. And so my team has never been co-located. And that's decades now. One of your recommendations is to level the playing field. What does that mean?
There are a set of historical norms around work that are about showing up. The signals of productivity often aren't necessarily output. It can be Jane shows up early, Jane stays late. And therefore, Jane is a dedicated hard worker. The challenge with that is it's more often John than it is Jane in those stories because we still have gender norms, especially in the US, especially where we have a lack of caregiving support and infrastructure, where women more often than men bear disproportionate load at home, that those sort of standard norms of showing that you're a hard worker, getting the opportunities, getting the promotion falls to people who are showing hustle. So the shift here is one, you alluded to this already. Instead of thinking about productivity in terms of activity, number of hours worked, clocking in, clocking out, or even number of emails that you create, which is also kind of horrifying, it's thinking about, is this the opportunity to actually start thinking about how we measure teams and people on the basis of the outcomes that they produce? And if so, that's a leveling the playing field for people from all kinds of backgrounds that says what we care about at the end of the day is your results, not whether or not you look like the boss or can act like the boss or can emulate the boss's behaviors.
This is an example of one of the things that flexible work encourages that would be a good practice if it was not flexible work at all.
Absolutely.
There's a number of things that you recommend where any company should be seriously figuring out how to know where outcomes come from. One of the tricks is that outcomes are largely a team product, and a lot of the way we measure performance is at the individual level. And so it seems like there's an inherent challenge there, but it's a good challenge to go after.
It's a critical one. And it's one that I know you've wrestled with and I've wrestled with, which is outcomes driven ways of managing people and leading people are so much more valuable, because then what you're doing is you're driving alignment around a set of goals as a team. You're getting people marching in a common direction. Getting that alignment is hard. Getting the decisions as an executive team about what are the most important goals that we're trying to drive is also hard. But the payoff isn't just that all of a sudden flexible work works. The payoff is you've got an aligned organization that's marching in common direction against a common set of goals. And you've got performance appraisal and management systems that make a lot more sense to people too. But it's hard work. It takes time and effort and energy. This is one of the big beneficial outcomes out of all of this discussion and debate is the number of companies that I'm seeing that are actually saying, hey, we've had to finally buckle down and put the time and effort into putting in, whether it's a objectives and key results type of process or something like it, that is taking that top-down discussion and working it all the way down the organization about how do we get alignment around goals.
I was speaking to somebody recently, Lena Selzer, and she runs a design firm. She has decided that her work experience product is going to be face-to-face. And so essentially what she's decided is, and this goes back to your first step, stand for something. She stands for human connection. And she hires people who want that. And they come in the morning and they have a circle. How's everybody doing? What are we doing today? They come together at lunch and just talk about stuff. And then at the end of the day, they circle up again, how to go today and some other topic. And she's built this through and through her organization. And it strikes me that there's a kind of wisdom in that. Not a kind of wisdom. There's actual wisdom in that. So it strikes me that there's wisdom in that, which is know what your product is. And don't try to be a middle of the road, satisfy everything product. It's like saying, I'm going to make the best truck in the world and it's going to be an amazing sedan. And you're like, no, you can't actually get those in the same product. So when you recommend that people stand for something, is it sometimes this is who we're going to be as a work experience?
Yeah. And I do think that's a great example, because having a principled stance and having the operations that back it up in any given direction is better than having a very lightweight, means nothing set of policies around it. I think from Elaine's perspective, that's great. She'll attract a certain group of people that want that as their work experience. I think as a startup or smaller companies, it's actually a lot easier to pick an end of that spectrum that's further out in some respects, and to have those things which are, hey, we are 10 of us that are building this thing and it's going to be wicked hard. And the 10 of us have agreed that we are in the office and together 5 days a week, or sometimes 6 days a week. Or the 10 of us are actually already, because we've worked together in the past, a couple of us, distributed in several different cities. So we're going to get together once a month and go deep, but we're also going to make sure that what we do is we have really good alignment around schedules and availability for each other when we're distributed in different places. And we're going to keep hiring the best talent regardless of where they sit. But having that one way or another be really clear is much more important than getting the right one. Be aligned around what you're doing in the first place. I do think it gets much more challenging as you get a bigger organization, because your teams are vastly different.
And I was going to say, she has the advantage that her company level and team level are almost the same. And so she's able to make team level agreements that are company wide.
Exactly.
Because it's the same thing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The Allstate, 50,000 employees, has a marketing design team that sounds a lot like what Elaine is doing. They are designers. They're touching product. They're seeing each other's stuff. They are 3 days a week in the office, Tuesday, Wednesdays, and Thursdays. That's the agreement. And we're all in mostly in Chicago and a couple other places. But they also have a marketing analyst team that's big and broad and distributed that gets together once a month. And that's just with a marketing organization, let alone think about the organizational differences between regional sales teams versus your central product and engineering organization versus your customer service function. Very different patterns and rhythms of the work. And especially as you grow and get successful, they're going to be more distributed, they're going to be more global. You got to start thinking about the digital connections as much as you do the physical connections for sure once you're past sort of minimum scale of locations.
I think we've hit the first three. We've hit stand for something. We've hit level the playing field. We've talked about commit to how you work at team level agreements. Got those three. Your fourth point is experiment, experiment, experiment. But the fourth thing you say is normalize. And so I understand experiment, which is let's try stuff out and see how it works. What's the last normalize?
Look, experimentation and iteration matters. And you can find almost always, when I talk to leaders in organizations, I'll say to them, look, you can read my stuff. You can look at the research. I can connect you with other companies that have done cool stuff. But somewhere inside your organization, someone's already doing half this stuff today. There are already people that are experimenting with new ways of working that you're going to learn from and use them. Normalize becomes, how do you take those people? How do you find the things that are working? And how do you start spreading them? How do you turn them into champions? How do you help them become the sort of examples that you then build on top of and customize for other parts of the organization? I'll give you an example. We did this work at Slack. Like a lot of people, we had a major problem with meeting burnout. We were all kind of fried because, especially as we moved into, we were, by the way, completely office-centric pre-pandemic at Slack, as much as anybody on the planet. But the shift, all of a sudden, we're in so many virtual meetings on a nonstop basis. So in fall of 2020, we ran our first Maker Week. So a Maker Week is cancel all your recurring meetings. And Tamar, Yehoshua, and I had both done this at Google, actually, in the past, and said, hey, look, let's just take a 1-week break. But we don't want to just take a break. What we want to do is use that time to think about which of these meetings do we still really need or not need. But also, on the ones that we do need, can we start to figure out how we do more of that work asynchronously up front? Can we take the weekly project check-in meeting that's grown from being 8 people to 32? Can we take some of the work that's done in that meeting, which is basically checking in on status? Can we do that asynchronously separately? Can we go back to having an 8-person meeting that's actually going to make decisions on resource allocation decisions or things that need to happen to unblock a team? So doing that in that group first, then led to, let's do it again. Let's do it a third time, iteration. Then sat there and said, hey, look, it's really working. The marketing team caught on to it and said, okay, how do we do that? We have a different set of meetings and standards and practices and norms. So that they picked it up. The sales team picked it up and started calling it Customer Week instead of Maker Week. They actually took some of the same habits, but they also had to figure out how do we customize this, because a weekly pipeline review is different from a weekly project status check-in. But what you're doing is you're finding the things that work. You're getting them sort of proven out, and then you're helping the rest of the organization adopt those practices. And you know this really well too, I'm sure. You have to put some support mechanisms underneath it. It doesn't just happen because people hear about it. You got to have some degree of support around communications, learning, and development that's actually helping take that little spark and flame, fan it, get it bigger, and help bring it to other parts of the organization.
You changed the way I read this now, which is that it says it's experiment, 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 and normalize. The first thing is that those experiments may be in 3 different groups. Each instance of how a group is designing themselves is an experiment, and you can have hundreds of those going on simultaneously. The trick is to listen effectively and to learn from them so that you can then package it up as a reusable template for how to run teams so other people don't have to experiment as much.
The beauty of this is you can always find people who are willing to put some effort into this because they want their own team's work to be seen, or because they have a problem and they want to contribute to it. They want to be involved in that experimentation. And it's interesting. We did this, for example, with hybrid meetings, because everybody hates hybrid meetings. How do you handle the fact that some people are in the room and other people are on the other end of the call and can't get a word in edgewise? So we actually had a group of people, several groups of people, volunteer to run a set of experiments. And we didn't necessarily tell them what to do in their experiment. We just said, we want you to each try something different. tell us what you did, tell us what worked and what didn't, but share it amongst all of us so we're all seeing it and talking about it. And that just drove more engagement, involvement, energy. It also built connections among some of those people. They got to know one another across the different groups. There was sort of a really cool side effect coming out of it. And we then found a couple of really simple guidelines that everybody could agree to that were like, hey, that really works. It turns out if you stick somebody close to the screen up front that can be the hybrid meeting moderator, you're going to get more balance of participation across the two parts of the room. Simple tips and tricks that come out of it that people then gravitate towards, as opposed to a 15-page long how to conduct a meeting document.
How how does a company create a culture of connection from anywhere? And I think that if you're a big company, you have to be able to do that. It doesn't matter whether there's flexible work or not. But what are some of the experiments that you've seen work that maybe we can normalize on?
There is power in getting people together and breaking bread together. That is undeniable in a lot of different ways. And there are minimum standards for teams that I try to adhere to and support that are actually based in experimentation and research and evidence. Atlassian has some of the best work out there around this stuff, talking about the fact that teams that get together 3 or 4 times a year have much higher engagement amongst each other and, importantly, with the organization than people who don't get together, number one, but also people who are just in the office on a semi-regular basis. Because if you're together several times a year and you're spending a good chunk of that time building deeper connections and relationships with one another, it just has this bolstering effect that lasts for the next 4 to 5 months coming out of it, than simply falling into the rut of showing up in the office. And so there's evidence behind that. The art of this then is, how do you figure out how you orchestrate some of those things so that people bump into each other and don't just bump into the same people all the time? If it's just my team that's getting together, then I lose a little bit of the social cohesion of seeing other teams. Zillow's got one of my favorite examples in this. They've got a 4-person team that orchestrates what they call Z retreats, which is the entire company gets together on some basis of frequency. And they just have people that are helping manage the kind of cruise calendar, is what they call it, of finance and HR are going to do their big gatherings. We're going to overlap those two because those two groups have some projects and work in common. And each of them is going to have some time together, some time on their own, teams and sub-teams, et cetera, et cetera. And so that orchestration goes a long way. The other side of this, though, is building digital connection matters just as much. And we are now 2 generations of digital natives in the workforce that are very used to building and certainly sustaining connections digitally as well as in real life. And so the digital tools that we use at work actually end up being a substrate for doing that. I worked at Slack for a number of years. I remember early on, 2017, sitting with a group of CIOs who talked about the random channel in Slack and how that was an annoyance and they wish it would go away. In 2021, I had some of the same CIOs saying, thank God for the water cooler channel that we set up, because that's how my team shares pictures of the kids and what'd you do last weekend and build social connection at work. A great example out of a guy I was talking with who said during the pandemic, he was missing his friends who were all sneakerheads. They're all sneaker collectors. And so he started up a group DM with about 5 of them, sharing on a day in, day out basis. What were they seeing? What were they buying? What are you wearing today? And that group of 5 became 100, and it became 1,000, and it became 1,500 people around the globe that were all sneakerheads sharing a connection with one another. And the cool thing is, you're not just building connections with fellow sneakerheads, you're also meeting somebody in marketing when you're in sales. And we worry, and rightfully, about weak connections at work. One of the ways that you build weak connections at work is not just in real life, you build them digitally also. And so finding ways to spur community at work goes a long way.
One of the things I noticed when Cisco went, I still can't tell if this was just an accident of history. I mean, I don't have data. I have anecdote that I lived through. I felt like when we went remote, it was a lot easier to become tribal, which is the only people you ever met were people who you were working on a project with. And everybody else was hypothetical. And the problem with being hypothetical is that I can decide to paint you a lot of different ways if I don't have a lot of data. And so the thing about connection, it seems to me, is that horizontal connection is vertical connection, super important. I've always had a rule: project teams need to get together in person once, at least once, because you don't understand anybody's body language until you see them be sarcastic in person. But once you've heard it once,
Oh, Brian's just a smart aleck.
exactly, exactly. So there's vertical connection, and then there's this horizontal connection, which is people not in your organization. Trickier to create.
It is in any environment in some ways, because what you get is it's those people over in that other building.
Yeah.
That other building makes me crazy. Or the executive floor that you're not allowed on except when you have to do a command performance. You can get the physical as well as the virtual versions of this stuff. And so part of that is, how do you find ways, especially as a leader, to start doing your own cross fertilization with different teams? That can be as simple as talking with your peers and saying, let's do lunch and learns with each other. Just offer it up for people as a way to share context and content and what they're doing. And I do think there is an important element to this, which is, how do you just encourage the social aspects as part of this? The happy hours, whether they're virtual or in real life, aren't really the thing, right? It's, how do I get people working together on something or talking with each other and getting a deeper understanding? So even that example of experiments, of multiple teams that were willing to do experiments, consisted of people who were then, one of the people, put it this way, when we're connecting through experiments, it doesn't feel like BS. I've got a reason for doing this. I got a reason for meeting these other people. It doesn't feel like you're just throwing me into a random social situation where I'm still going to cluster with the people I know, because let's face it, I'm just going to stick with my tribe.
Yeah. In your book, you don't just have a bunch of recommendations. So it's not purely, this would be a good idea if you did it. You provide a whole set of tools. There's a tool for creating flexible work, purpose and principles. There's a bunch of different tools. I want to come at that, but I want to come at it from a different direction in your life, which is that you're on the board of a very large number of startups that are working to equip different kinds of work. So what that does, that gives you a perspective that I think would be really valuable, which is, what are you seeing emerge to enable a different future of work? And what problems are they solving?
Wow, that's a great question. I'll give you a couple of examples using a couple of different ones. There are a number of players in the workplace world, meaning physical offices, the places where we come together, that are doing a variety of things to help address some of the underlying challenges of flexibility. Simplest example is, this was hilarious because this was happening at Slack. We're like, we want to come together, but we can't figure out who's going to be in the office when. So Cadence, one of the folks that I do work with, is one of the folks out there that has, and Scoop is another one that has great tools for helping teams figure out what their frequency is and why they're coming together, and help coordinate not only time in the office, but your meetings as well, and events and gatherings and things like that. So simple little affordances that just make it much easier, so you don't have the problem of, I showed up and nobody else did, or I can't figure out how to make this work. That then plays into a whole set of things that are actually really beneficial if you happen to be managing a workplace in the first place, which is, workplace managers are all of a sudden faced with a heck of a lot more demands for, how do I support flexible teams? And that goes to things like, what are the tools that help people come together? But it also goes to things like, all of a sudden, my employees are way more distributed. Why would I plunk down a lease in each one of those locations, when instead what I might be able to do is strike a deal with a flexible work provider? The challenge in that is, what people don't want these days is the standard, hey, WeWork will take down 10 spots and we'll sign a contract for the next 6 months. What they want is, I need about 10 spots most days of the week, but I need 100 once a month for the sales team that's coming together for the regional meeting for a week. And so there are a lot of people who are also thinking about space on a more flexible basis. An office is a tool. It's a really important tool. But our use of it all of a sudden is going from being a very static thing to being much more dynamic. So you got to be able to manage that. The other side of this, people leaders and people managers, all of a sudden, I think all of these problems pre-exist this, right? Managing distributed teams was always a challenge for a certain number of people. Moving from activity-based measurements of somebody to outcomes-driven management is something that predates it. How do I better leverage and utilize technology? And so the folks at Charter are a great resource for people in the HR space, but also people leaders that are looking for what's the latest research, plus what are tactical ways that I can help drive improvements in leadership training, management performance, especially with the lens around things like AI, diversity and inclusion, and flexibility.
In the first example, it's a very interesting idea about managing density of physical proximity. That's the way I think of it, which is we're going to bring people together in concentrated form sometimes, and that's going to be the way you start off a fusion weapon. We're going to bring everybody together, and then they disperse, and we want both, and we want to be able to accommodate both. If we do it wrong, we're not going to get the real estate dividend. And in fact, earlier when we were talking, there's this question of, can we be conscious of how we are going to turn a percentage of the real estate dividend into travel and events? It's very easy to just say, woot, less real estate and not give anybody any more money from that dividend to actually form those connections.
That's right. What's going on underneath that one is what most CEOs and CFOs didn't know pre-pandemic was that the seats in their offices were only about 50% occupied. Everybody, including us, got a surprise when you started looking at the data in 2021. Hey, we're planning on bringing everybody back. By the way, the meeting rooms were always overbooked. Whether somebody was actually in the meeting room or not is a different set of issues. But pre-pandemic, 50% was about the norm in terms of percentage of time that an individual seat was occupied in an office building. Now that's more like 25%. So CFOs understandably are looking at that and going, I know the answer, cut office space. But the challenge is you need to not just cut office space, you need to reinvest that set of proceeds into a couple of things. One is you got to redesign the space that you keep because we got to invert that relationship. You got to go from 70% of the space being open office floor plans to 70% of what remains being collaborative workplace spaces for teams. That's different. And the other part of it is you got to fund the travel and the experiences and getting people together. Most of the firms that I've talked with and worked with on this, I've actually published some stuff from Allstate and Zillow on this one, basically did a close to even trade. They may have saved a little bit of money, but you're reinvesting the funds in team development, in better spaces, in more flexible spaces, in more locations. You're giving people the tools they need to be effective.
An additional challenge is that for many organizations, the real estate dividend is slow to be realized because of the lease duration. And so you're not using the space anymore as intensely, but you can't get rid of it. And so maybe someday you'll get that dividend, but not immediately.
Yeah, not anytime soon.
Are there any other interesting enablement plays that you see out there that may be technological or not? And I'll give you a couple of examples. For instance, globalization partners, which makes it very feasible to manage payroll internationally so that people can also move. Or we had Rekha Magan, one of the founders of Boundless Life on the show, who is creating schools that kids can go to 3 months at a time in all the digital nomad locations around the world and be in the same curriculum and move from place to place. And so like these are the kinds of things where enablement is coming forward. Are there any other enablement plays that are creating the infrastructure of more flexibility?
From a place flexibility perspective, a lot more of this has to do with exactly what you're getting at, which is how do you make it easier for companies to hire more people in more locations? Because the legal and HR and tax stuff is onerous. It's a real challenge for people. And so everything from like Oyster, remote.com, people like that make that much easier are big advantages. They're a leg up for people. We've talked about flexibility in terms of place. We actually haven't talked about it in terms of time, which actually is the bigger deal in a lot of ways. In pouring through all of our data for years and years, in fact, people value schedule flexibility more than they value location flexibility. And the two are obviously related. If you have to go in the office 5 days a week, 9 to 5, you have no schedule flexibility either. But schedule flexibility is a much bigger deal, especially when you get into caregivers and other groups. And when you dig like a layer deeper underneath that, what people are also talking about is I need focus time during the day. My days have been turned into Swiss cheese because everybody and their uncle is piling a meeting on top of it. And there's no 2 hour block, let alone an hour block sometimes, to get my heads down work done. And this is a particular challenge for frontline managers who carry often an individual burden as well as the managerial load. So there are some cool tools out there that are actually trying to get at that set of problems from a technology perspective, not just a good, healthy practices perspective. Clockwise is a great example. They do a lot in terms of helping you optimize your calendar. And when I talk with people about this, individuals and frontline managers get it right away and they love it. And executives go, that would never work for me. My day is full of meetings. And they're right, but they also have an admin most of the time that can handle it for them. So what we're really talking about is how do you provide tools that help people build some boundaries so they can get that focus time? And how do you train managers to also preferably understand that focus time is a real big benefit to people individually, but also to their ability to produce? Most people don't do their best work at 10 o'clock at night after the kids are in bed.
Yeah. There's a way in which it identifies that there might be two, again, going back to sort of the ethical or the moral question, which is we want freedom, but there are different kinds of freedom. One kind of freedom is freedom of place. One kind of freedom is freedom of schedule. Or we say flexibility. Flexibility is nice because it doesn't imply total freedom necessarily. It just says it's bounded freedom.
There's an element to that, again, that comes back to the same sets of issues, which is individual freedom at its utmost to decide your own schedule doesn't work either because teams need regular time to be in sync. So really straightforward practice. What's your core collaboration hours as a team? Especially if you've got a team that's spread out across multiple time zones. Having the conversation up front that says, hey, from 10 a.m. until 2 p.m. West Coast time, which is 1 until 5 on the East Coast, we expect everybody to be available for meetings, for chats, for one-on-ones, for quick correspondence. That doesn't mean that we don't occasionally schedule a meeting outside of that, but it means that the expectation is I'm going to ask you first before I do it, or I'm at least going to put a higher bar on doing that so that I'm not throwing something in when you're picking up a kid from school or during dinner time on the East Coast, or basically blowing up your ability to focus.
Yeah. I think that that's something that Dropbox implemented. I don't know if they started it, but one of the things they found is people said, it's great to have core collaboration hours, but how am I going to fit 8 hours of meetings into 4 hours of core collaboration? And they had to dig a little deeper and say, tell us about the source of those 8 hours of meetings. And do you really need all of them?
That's right. That goes back to how do you teach people to do some of the work asynchronously that should be done asynchronously? You and I have been in the meetings where we actually got there on Slack, 150 people in a Monday morning operations meeting waiting for their turn to say on track. These are not good uses of time, folks.
No.
And by the way, it went from being an hour-long meeting with 45 people to an hour and a half to a 2-hour-long meeting with 150 people, at which point your ability to pay attention is also shot. Taking that and turning it into the asynchronous parts that have to happen up front is part of what Dropbox is getting at, right? Which is, hey, look, there are some key elements to that meeting, which is we've got a resource conflict or we've got a problem that needs to be resolved. Let's focus on that. But how do we gather the data ahead of time so we invite the right people to the meeting to have the right discussion, as opposed to saying all 150 of you need to show up? So asynchronous is a big deal and it's hard to teach and train, but you get there at a team level by talking about meetings themselves are going to be for debates, for decision making, for development of people. Let's use it for that. And let's start giving people the ability to say, let's take this example of a status check meeting and let's do it asynchronously, and give people the ability to say, hey, look, I don't get what the purpose of this meeting is. I don't know why we're even getting together. I'm not going to come. And giving people the ability to say no is hard, but you got to get there.
There's a lot more to the future of work than flexibility. And without saying AI,
Absolutely.
Are there any other trends you see emerging that we should be paying attention to?
Demographic shifts. So future of work, The flexibility is not that big of a thing in the broader scheme of things, but it's indicative of a broader set of shifts that are going on, right? Which is demographic shifts, technology shifts, cultural shifts are a lot of what's driving all of this set of changes that sit there. We are in a place where a lot of developing countries around the globe have declining populations over the next couple of decades. That is a major shift in what's going to happen from a talent perspective. There is growing evidence that a lot of executives were under a lot of pressure during the great resignation phase, right? If you look at the data underlying that, that great resignation was really mostly frontline workers. Office workers, yes, and office workers had sometimes outrageous demands for what they wanted from their employers. But the reason why that happened had a lot more to do with frontline workers. That's not going away anytime soon because we don't have the population growth in the United States, in Western Europe, in China that we once did. And so, as a managerial set of changes, thinking about how do I attract and retain talent is only going to go up in importance over the next couple of decades. And the more transactional you treat your talent, the more likely it is that it's going to bite you over the long term. I think that's a huge shift.
I agree. And just going to make one prediction on that. Here's my prediction. Nations are going to start stealing other nations' children. What that means is that if you're a country that can attract working age people from other countries, you will. If you're smart, because your own demographics are starting to look bad. And there's some countries that can't attract anybody from any other country. And there's some countries who can. And I think it's going to be a really big play.
The US obviously can attract people from other countries. We have gone very backwards in some sense around that in recent years.
We have.
It is to our disadvantage in a lot of real ways that are real challenging.
I absolutely agree. I have friends who are thinking about where they're going to live next, and they're in Singapore or someplace like that. And one of them, of the couple, happens to be Muslim and says, I don't want to go to the United States. I can see how people are talking about Muslims there, and I don't want to go there. And so that's a real problem for nations.
Yep. And the other thing that's happening that's part of that similar demographic shift is we are becoming a more diverse society. Growth from a population perspective in the United States is no longer, majority white Caucasian. And there's been the DEI backlash, which is, to my perspective, fairly unattractive. There's a backlash to the backlash. This is not an issue that's going away. This is something that is hard work. There's underlying research that gets at this. Diverse teams do build better outcomes. There's tons of studies from McKinsey and BCG and Bain and Deloitte and everybody else that sort of shows this. But there's also great academic research that says building diverse teams is hard because you come from different perspectives and different understandings and different points of view. And it takes more work to get there, and it can be challenging. The payoff is there, but it's going to take hard work to get real, deeper understanding of one another in order to get the most out of people. And again, it's also going to come back to talent advantage. And by the way, I can say technology without saying AI.
Yes.
Technology adoption is actually a really big deal, and technology adoption is challenging. I'll give you an example. Back to the executives walking hallways. I think one of the big challenges that actually drove some of the, especially early return to office mandates in 2022 was executives were coming back into the office during a time when economic pressure was growing. Late 2022, 2023, recession worries, all the rest of this. Business was no longer flying super high like it was actually surprisingly in 2020 and 2021. So executives are under pressure. They're coming back into an office that's largely empty. By the way, I led teams through the 2008, 2009 recession. Everybody was in the office. You could hear it. You could hear the vibe in the hallway in the conversations. If you're showing up into an empty office and you're not hearing the vibe, then you don't know if people are really taking it seriously or not. The challenge, though, is executives themselves are the ones that often are not the ones in the digital tools where people are having those conversations. So whether it's Slack or Microsoft Teams or Google Chat or whatever else, I've just run into this situation again and again where the senior leadership team is like, that stuff's great for the teams, but I'm not in that. I'm over here in email or text message, text me if you need me type of stuff. But what they're missing out on, to some degree, is the social connection stuff that we talked about earlier, but they're also missing out on the work. They're missing out on the conversations about the customer that they're trying to get closed, about the problems that the marketing team is running into. And so there's a digital tool adoption challenge that we've got in the executive suite as well that I think people have to figure out. And that'll play its way forward also in terms of things like generative AI and all the rest of this too. But you kind of got to get your hands dirty. You got to get into this stuff because it is going to be a shift that's going to be with us forever.
One of the products that I think could exist is something that shows the buzz of the company online. So show me all the active connections between people that are happening right now on a bunch of different platforms. And let's color code the connections based upon the nature of the sentiment. We could do that, right? We could absolutely do that. We could say there are 10,000 people talking in clusters of approximately 5 apiece, and these ones are laughing and these ones are angry. We could totally do that. And what you'd get is you'd get a detect for people who came into those empty offices and actually can say, oh no, this company's actually buzzing. It's just buzzing in little closed digital spaces right now.
That's right. Organizational and network analysis on top of these tool sets is a thing.
Well, in real time. I mean, it needs to be like, what's the buzz right now?
In retrospect, with a study that's done over the course of several years, isn't quite the same as. I'll give you an example though. Like Slack, I'm sure Teams has this too to some degree. Slack has analytics on, like, people will set up announcements channels, right? They're like the global announcements or the team announcements or the whatever else. Emoji are a form of reaction and interaction. And so you can see very visibly what's lighting people up in a good way and in a bad way. You can also tell something when we announce, hey, here's the next new feature that's going out. If the marketing team is the ones that are super gung ho and the sales team is like crickets, that's signal. So all of these digital tools produce signal, and they produce emotional signal as much as they produce real output too.
I like that. I like that. This is the thing that we're going to build. So it's a network, it's real time, it's got sentiment analysis, and it's got topic. So now everybody's talking about this product, and anonymous though. I don't want to be tracking everybody by name, but also you need to track person A is in this meeting, person B is in this meeting. What's their chat sentiment between them? If the chat sentiment is, this is idiotic, I'm dying over here. That's actually the real news, is not what people are saying publicly, but it's the connections behind.
And there's really interesting data too about who's talking, who's not talking. And there's the usual of, is the leader taking up too much of the airtime, or are the people even getting a chance to get over in edgewise as you go through these things? There's also just the sentiment and the sort of, how do you manage your employees' engagement on hot topics and on policies that impact them. And that is hard work, but there's some great work that I've seen done around guardrails for internal engagement and how you at least try to put in place norms around that too, so that as a leadership team, you feel like you can engage on topics that are meaningful and material to you and still do it in a way in which you keep it civil, which is really often hard to do these days.
I have a few closing questions that I always ask on the show. One of them is, what job do you hire your job to do for you? So it hires you to do something for it. People hire you to do something for them. What do you hire it to do for you?
Give me energy and help me have impact. I love the work that I'm doing these days. For the past 4 years, as I've been digging deeper into and understanding how to build healthy cultures in ways that go beyond what I did as a practitioner, as an operator, I've just had a blast learning from talking with other people, from their examples, from what they're seeing out there, and sharing what I know, examples that I've seen work, because I love learning, and I actually love the fact that my job, I think, has positive impact on people, and that brings me joy.
What does it cost you?
I have a tough time saying no. I've always had a bit of a challenge with saying no. And so there are times when I don't get the boundaries right in my personal life. And I am much better at this age and stage by far than I was decades ago. at monitoring myself, at making sure I'm taking care of my relationships as well as my health. But the danger zone is because I love what I do, I will do more of it. Sometimes more of it than I should.
Yeah. That's a response I've actually gotten quite often, which is if work is a product, you can't get every feature in one product. And so you're constantly having to make product trade offs. And people want their work to take care of their family, but work takes them away from their family. So they want their work to do that financially. And I agree, the more passionate you are about something, the harder it can be to strike the right balance.
Yeah, absolutely. That balance is something that I know I didn't get right over the years a number of times. And my spouse and I have talked about it extensively, both in a much better space these days. But it's one of those things where you kind of have the, I wish I'd known then what I know now. But the other thing I also realize is you never did and you never will. So you take what you have learned and you try to apply it going forward.
My daughter once said, I don't know if she was 4 years old, she was very young, and she was saying to a friend of hers, she said, "It's like my dad is dead already." First of all,
Ugh.
that is, there's a coldness to the already. It's just a matter of time, but it seems like he's. But yeah, I changed my behavior. Not entirely, but a lot.
Yeah. I may have had a similar moment walking the hallways of my kids' elementary school and seeing pinned on the wall an essay from my son, who was then in fourth grade, that had a very similar sentiment about essentially, I see the deadness in my dad's eyes.
Oh, oh
Yeah.
no.
And
That's different.
yeah.
That's different, though. It's not that you weren't
Yeah.
there. It's that something in your job was killing you.
Yeah. And that was a point in time when that was true.
Uh-huh.
I got out of that situation.
That's good.
Yeah.
Where can people learn more about you and your work?
LinkedIn. I'm on LinkedIn. I post prolifically, maybe sometimes more than I should, but it's the best place to follow me and to get in contact with me and learn more. You can also obviously pick up the book, How the Future Works. It's lovely. And a lot of the work that we did for the past 3-4 years is on futureforum.com as well.
Yeah. And Future Forum is very much like a research coalition. It's a bunch of people coming together and sharing best practices and learning from each other. And a lot of those best practices came together in the book. And so the book itself, it's experiment, 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 and then normalize. Well, that's what it is. It's a history of experiments coming together, and it provides very practical, here's a template. Do this,
Exactly.
and you'll know something you didn't know before.
Literally templates. Yeah,
Literally
exactly.
templates. Exactly. Thank you very much for coming on the show.
Dart, thanks for having me. This has been a fantastic conversation. I've loved it.
Thanks for joining me for another episode of Work for Humans. If you enjoyed this episode, please give us a 5-star rating wherever you listen to podcasts. And share the show with one person you think would get value from it. Believe it or not, this really helps us grow the show and reach more people who want to build the kind of work that people really want. As always, thank you to my producer, Jason Ames at Ninth Path Audio, for his insights into content and his high standard for quality. Final note, the opinions shared here are my own and not the views of Google or Cisco Systems. Thanks again for listening. See you next time.